Chapter 1. The Mysterious Death of Mr. Charles Holworth. London, 1893. A thick fog rolled through the streets, curling around gas lamps like ghostly fingers. It was a cold and dreary evening, the sort that made a man long for the warmth of a fireplace and a strong cup of tea. Inside 221B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, fingers steepled before him, his sharp eyes lost in the dancing flames of the hearth. Beside him, I, Dr. John Watson, occupied my usual seat, perusing the latest edition of the Times. The evening had been quiet. Too quiet. Holmes, ever restless when deprived of a stimulating case, had taken to playing his violin, a sure sign that his mind was in need of engagement. I had just turned the page of my newspaper when a sudden knock at the door shattered the stillness. "Ah," Holmes murmured, setting aside his violin. "That, Watson, is the sound of something interesting at last." Mrs. Hudson, our ever-reliable landlady, appeared a moment later, her expression one of mild concern. "A visitor for you, Mr. Holmes." "A Mr. James Willoughby." "Show him in," Holmes instructed. A few seconds later, a well-dressed but visibly shaken man entered. He was in his late 20s, with dark, neatly combed hair and intelligent brown eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his gloves, his face pale and drawn. "You are Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, breathlessly. "I am," Holmes replied, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "And this is my colleague, Dr. John Watson. Pray, tell us what brings you here at such an hour." James Willoughby sat down, clutching his hat in his hands. "It is my employer, Mr. Charles Holworth. He is dead." "Indeed?" Holmes' eyes narrowed with interest. "Go on. It happened just 2 hours ago," Willoughby said, his voice unsteady. "Mr. Holworth received a letter, one he had been expecting with great urgency. The moment he read it, he collapsed. We summoned Dr. Lambert immediately, but it was too late. He was gone within minutes." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "What did the doctor determine as the cause of death?" "That is precisely the mystery," Willoughby exclaimed. "Dr. Lambert could find no obvious reason. No wounds, no sign of struggle. It was as if he simply stopped living." Holmes tapped his fingers together thoughtfully. "And this letter, where is it now? I brought it with me." Willoughby reached into his coat pocket and carefully extracted an envelope. "It is addressed to Mr. Holworth in an unfamiliar handwriting." Holmes took the envelope and examined it closely, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. He sniffed the paper, held it up to the light, and finally he withdrew the letter itself. I leaned in to see, but it appeared to contain only a few short lines of text. Holmes read it aloud. "Mr. Holworth, you must be careful. Danger is closer than you realize. Trust no one. They are watching." The note was unsigned. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "Tell me, Mr. Willoughby, who was present when your employer received this letter?" "Myself, of course," Willoughby replied. "As his personal secretary, I handle all his correspondence." Mr. Holworth opened it in his study, alone. A moment later, I heard him gasp. When I entered, he was already on the floor. "Did he say anything before he collapsed?" "Only a single word," Willoughby said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He looked at me, his face contorted in shock, and he said, 'You.'" A heavy silence filled the room. Holmes studied Willoughby with his piercing gaze, assessing every detail of his demeanor. "You realize, of course, how damning that sounds," Holmes said finally. "I do," Willoughby exclaimed, "and I swear I had nothing to do with it. I came to you because I fear I may be blamed. The police are already suspicious." Holmes stood abruptly. "We must go to Mr. Holworth's residence at once. There is no time to lose." The scene of the crime. Within the hour, we arrived at the grand home of Charles Holworth, a stately mansion in the heart of Mayfair. A uniformed constable stood at the door, barring entry. "This is a crime scene," he declared. Sherlock Holmes produced a small card from his pocket and presented it with a flourish. Sherlock Holmes. "I believe Inspector Lestrade is inside?" The constable hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, sir. Go on in." Inside, the house was in disarray. Servants huddled together in corners, whispering in hushed tones. A heavy tension hung in the air. We were led to the study, where Inspector Lestrade stood over the body of Charles Holworth. Lestrade looked up as we entered, his expression sceptical. "Holmes, I might have known you'd turn up." "And a good thing too," Holmes said breezily. "What have you found?" Lestrade grunted. "Not much. The doctor says there are no signs of foul play. No wounds. No poison found in the glass of brandy on his desk. But something killed him." Holmes crouched beside the body. Mr. Holworth lay slumped over his desk, his right hand still clutching the letter. His face was frozen in an expression of horror. Holmes examined his hands, his fingernails, and his lips. "Interesting," he murmured. "His lips are discoloured." "Yes," Lestrade said, "but the doctor insists no poison was found in his mouth." Holmes stood and moved to the desk. He examined the letter again, then turned his attention to the doorknob. Taking out a magnifying glass, he scrutinized it closely. A slow smile spread across his face. "Ah, now we are getting somewhere." Lestrade folded his arms. "What is it now, Holmes?" "Tell me, Inspector," Holmes said, straightening. "Has anyone tested the doorknob for poison?" Lestrade blinked. "The doorknob?" Holmes nodded. "Consider the facts. The letter itself is not poisoned." Holworth touched the letter, and shortly afterward, he collapsed. What if the poison was already on his hands before he even touched the paper? Lestrade's eyes widened in realization. "Good heavens! You mean—" "Exactly," Holmes said. "The poison was on the doorknob. When Holworth opened his study door, he unknowingly coated his fingers in it. Then, when he held the letter, the poison transferred onto the paper. The moment he touched his face, or even licked his fingers to turn the page, it was absorbed into his system." Lestrade called for his men to collect samples from the doorknob. Meanwhile, Holmes turned back to Willoughby. "You said this letter was expected. Who would have known about it?" Willoughby hesitated. "Only a few people. Myself, of course, his wife, his business partner, Mr. Edwin Carlyle." Holmes nodded. "Then we have 3 potential suspects. Gentlemen, I believe we have only just begun to unravel this mystery." And with that, the great detective set to work. Chapter 2. The First Suspect. The room was heavy with tension. The realization that Charles Holworth had been poisoned through his own doorknob sent ripples of unease through all those present. Even Inspector Lestrade, who often resisted Holmes' unconventional deductions, looked troubled. Holmes straightened his coat and turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, I assume you've already taken statements from the household?" Lestrade nodded. "The wife is in her chambers, still in shock. The business partner, Mr. Carlyle, is waiting in the parlour. And the servants, well, they're too frightened to be of much use." Holmes' keen eyes flickered toward James Willoughby, who stood near the doorway, still looking shaken. "And you, Mr. Willoughby, have you spoken to the police?" Willoughby swallowed. "I have told them everything I know. I only came to you because I feared the worst for myself." Holmes gave a sharp nod. "Then let us proceed in order. Mr. Carlyle first." Lestrade led us down the grand hallway, past oil paintings and heavy velvet drapes, until we reached the parlour. The room was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of cigar smoke. Seated in a high-backed chair was a tall, broad-shouldered man with greying hair and deep-set eyes. His sharp features twitched as he looked up at us. "Mr. Edwin Carlyle?" Holmes said. The man exhaled slowly, setting down his glass of brandy. "You must be Sherlock Holmes." His voice was low and steady, but his fingers betrayed a slight tremor. Holmes inclined his head. "Mr. Holworth's business partner, I presume?" Carlyle nodded. "For nearly 20 years, we built everything together." He gestured vaguely toward the grand furnishings of the room. "And now, he is gone." Holmes took a seat across from him. Tell me, Mr. Carlyle, when did you last see Mr. Holworth alive? Carlyle took a deep breath. Earlier today, at our offices. We had a meeting in the afternoon. He was in good spirits as far as I could tell. Was he expecting any trouble? Holmes asked. Carlyle hesitated. Not trouble exactly, but he did mention receiving a warning, something about danger, though he didn't take it too seriously. I assumed it was one of his many business competitors trying to rattle him. Holmes glanced at Watson and then back at Carlyle. And what about the letter he received this evening? Carlyle frowned. Letter? I wasn't aware of any letter. Holmes studied him for a long moment. You and Mr. Holworth built an empire together. Did you stand to gain anything from his death? Carlyle's expression darkened. That is an ugly suggestion, Mr. Holmes. Nevertheless, I must ask it, Holmes said. Carlyle sighed, rubbing his temples. I suppose I will inherit his shares in our company? But do you think I would have risked everything we worked for just for that? Holmes steepled his fingers. That depends, Mr. Carlyle. Was your partnership still amicable? Carlyle hesitated just a fraction too long before answering. Yes. We had occasional disagreements, but nothing that would lead to murder. Holmes smiled thinly. You have a good head for business, Mr. Carlyle, but perhaps not for deception. You hesitated before answering. There was a conflict, was there not? Carlyle's jaw tightened. If you must know, yes. We had a disagreement over a recent deal. He wanted to expand into shipping, while I thought it was too great a risk. It was a heated argument, but that's all it was. Did he seem worried about anything else? Carlyle hesitated, then exhaled. He did mention something peculiar. He thought someone had been inside his study when he was not home. Holmes' eyes gleamed. Indeed. And did he suspect anyone? No. He checked his belongings and said nothing was missing, so he dismissed it as paranoia. Holmes tapped his fingers together. And you, where were you this evening, Mr. Carlyle? Carlyle's brow furrowed. At my club, the Reform Club, from 6 until 9. You are welcome to verify it. Lestrade made a note. We will. Holmes stood. One last question, Mr. Carlyle. Did Mr. Holworth ever express distrust toward his secretary, Mr. Willoughby? Carlyle frowned. James? No. If anything, he trusted him implicitly. Holmes turned to Lestrade. We must examine the doorknob at once. If there are traces of poison, we will need to determine how it was applied and by whom. Returning to Holworth's study, Holmes retrieved his magnifying glass and examined the brass doorknob carefully. He pulled a small vial from his pocket, uncorked it, and let a single drop of a clear liquid fall onto the surface. Almost immediately, the liquid darkened to a deep blue. There it is, Holmes murmured. A contact poison. Quick-acting, but subtle enough to leave no immediate trace. Lestrade peered over his shoulder. What kind of poison? Holmes straightened. Most likely a rare derivative of aconitine. Fatal within minutes when absorbed through the skin. I shuddered, and whoever placed it there knew that Holworth would touch it. Holmes nodded. Which means our culprit had access to this study. We must speak to the household staff. Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper, was a plump, nervous woman with hands that fluttered like anxious birds. She wrung her apron as she spoke. Oh, sir, I never thought such a thing could happen in this house. Mr. Holworth was a good man, strict but fair. Who had access to the study? Holmes asked. Only Mr. Holworth, Mr. Willoughby, and myself. The other servants rarely entered. And when was the last time it was cleaned? This afternoon, sir. Holmes' expression sharpened. Did you notice anything unusual? Mrs. Whitmore hesitated. Well, I did find the door slightly ajar when I came to dust, but I assumed Mr. Willoughby had been in there. Holmes exchanged a glance with Lestrade. Mr. Willoughby, did you enter the study this afternoon? Willoughby looked startled. No, I was in the office all day. Holmes turned back to the housekeeper. Then someone else entered before the murder. Mrs. Whitmore wrung her hands. "I don't know, sir. I swear I saw no one." Holmes nodded. "That will be all for now." As we stepped into the hallway, Holmes stopped abruptly. His eyes flickered to the grand staircase, then to the long corridor leading to the servants' quarters. "Something is missing," he murmured. I frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Where is Mrs. Hallworth?" Lestrade blinked. "Still in her chambers, I presume." Holmes' gaze darkened. "Then why do I have the distinct feeling that she knows more than she is letting on?" Lestrade stiffened. "You think the widow—" Holmes turned on his heel. "I think it is time we had a word with Mrs. Hallworth." With that, he strode down the corridor, the mystery deepening with every step. The grand hallway leading to Mrs. Hallworth's chambers was eerily silent, the thick carpet muffling our steps. A sombre air lingered in the house, made all the more oppressive by the flickering candlelight that cast long, wavering shadows along the walls. Holmes led the way, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Lestrade knocked firmly on the door to the widow's chambers. After a long pause, a faint voice answered from within. "You may enter." Lestrade pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The room was dim, heavy curtains drawn tight against the outside world. The scent of lavender and brandy clung to the air. Louisa Hallworth sat in a large, ornately carved chair by the fireplace. A dark mourning dress draped her slender frame, and her eyes, red-rimmed and weary, flickered toward us as we entered. Holmes studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Mrs. Hallworth, I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my associate, Dr. Watson. My condolences for your loss." Louisa nodded stiffly. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes." Her voice was hoarse, as if she had wept until there were no more tears left to shed. "We must ask you a few questions regarding your husband's death," Holmes continued, his tone even. She sighed. "I expected as much. Please, ask what you must." Holmes took a slow step closer. "When did you last see your husband alive?" She inhaled shakily. "Just before dinner. He was in his study, as he often was. He seemed distracted, lost in thought, but he said nothing unusual." Holmes' gaze was piercing. "And did he mention the letter he received?" Louisa hesitated for a fraction of a second. "No," she answered, though there was something uncertain in her tone. Holmes steepled his fingers. "You are sure?" Her eyes flickered toward the fire. "Yes?" Holmes did not press the point. Instead, he glanced around the room, taking in every detail: the carefully arranged furniture, the untouched meal tray on a side table, the silk handkerchief clenched tightly in her lap. "Mrs. Hallworth," he said at last, "did your husband fear for his life?" She stiffened. "No. Why would he?" Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Because someone went to great lengths to ensure his demise. And yet, the method was indirect. Why not a gunshot? A knife? Poison slipped into his drink?" Louisa's grip on the handkerchief tightened. "I don't understand what you mean." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "The method of poisoning suggests someone close to him, someone with access to the house, to his private space. The murderer counted on him touching that doorknob, which means they knew his habits well." A long silence stretched between them. Then, softly, she spoke. "Are you accusing me, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes did not answer at once. He merely watched her, unblinking. "No," he said finally. "Not yet." Louisa's breath hitched. She turned away, staring into the fire. "I loved my husband, Mr. Holmes," she whispered. "Whatever you think of me, you must believe that." Holmes' expression remained unreadable. "And yet, there is something you are not telling me." She did not answer. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Has the house been searched thoroughly?" Lestrade frowned. "Not beyond the study and the immediate area." Holmes' lips pressed into a thin line. "That is a mistake. Mrs. Hallworth, I must insist that we search this room." Her head snapped up. "You have no right. I have every right when a man has been murdered," Holmes interrupted. "Inspector?" Lestrade hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I'm afraid I must insist, Mrs. Hallworth. She paled, but said nothing more. Holmes moved through the room with careful precision, opening drawers, shifting books, examining every item with his usual thoroughness. I watched in fascination as his mind worked at a speed beyond any ordinary man's. Then he stopped, his eyes fixed on the ornate writing desk near the window. Slowly, he stepped forward, his fingers running along the edges. Then, with a deft movement, he pressed a small, nearly invisible notch on the side of the drawer. With a faint click, a hidden compartment slid open. Inside, folded neatly, was a single letter. Holmes carefully retrieved it, his sharp gaze scanning the paper. Then, without a word, he handed it to me. I unfolded it and began to read. My breath caught in my throat. Louisa, you are in danger. I fear that if I do not act soon, you will be the one to suffer. I cannot explain everything yet, but please, be cautious. Watch those around you. If anything happens, know that I tried to protect you. Yours, Charles. I looked up in shock. He wasn't the target. His wife was. Louisa's face had gone deathly pale. Her hands trembled as she reached for the letter. No, this can't be. Holmes' voice was quiet but firm. Your husband believed someone was trying to kill you, and in attempting to warn you, he unwittingly triggered his own death. A shuddering breath escaped her lips. But who would do this? Holmes turned to Lestrade. Inspector, we now have a new question to answer. Who had reason to want Mrs. Hallworth dead? Lestrade ran a hand through his hair. Blast it all, Holmes. This changes everything. If someone wanted her dead, then the poisoning was a mistake. Or worse, a misdirection. Holmes nodded. Indeed. Which means our suspect list must shift. Lestrade rubbed his temples. We have got Carlyle, the business partner. He could have had his own reasons. Holmes shook his head. Carlyle expected to inherit shares of the company. Killing Hallworth only solidified his control. If his true target was Louisa, then he had nothing to gain. What about Willoughby? I asked. Holmes' gaze sharpened. Yes, the letter was left for him originally. He came to us fearing for his life. But what if his fear was an act? What if he knew the real plan all along? Louisa clutched her shawl. But James was like family to us. He had no reason to want me dead. Holmes' voice was soft but unwavering. Are you sure? A sudden knock at the door interrupted us. One of Lestrade's men appeared, looking uneasy. Sir, we found something in Mr. Willoughby's room. Holmes' eyes gleamed. What precisely? The officer hesitated. A vial. A small glass vial with traces of a dark liquid inside. Lestrade straightened. Bring it here. The vial was produced. A tiny bottle, barely larger than a finger, with a few drops of an inky substance clinging to the bottom. Holmes took it, lifting it to the candlelight. He uncorked it, took a cautious sniff, and then smiled. Aconitine, he murmured. The very same poison that killed Charles Hallworth. I exhaled. Then, Willoughby? Holmes turned toward the door. It is time we had a word with Mr. James Willoughby. Chapter 4. The Truth Unfolds. The atmosphere in the house was thick with a sense of foreboding, each passing moment growing heavier with the weight of impending revelation. The small vial of aconitine still sat on the table, a stark reminder of the dark turn this investigation had taken. James Willoughby, once thought to be a harmless secretary caught in the crossfire of a tragic event, now stood at the centre of Holmes' scrutiny. Lestrade motioned to his officers. You'll want to take Mr. Willoughby to a separate room, Holmes. Holmes' eyes were fixed on the vial as he considered the implications. No, I will speak with him here. There's no need to complicate matters further until we have more answers. We made our way down the hallway to Willoughby's quarters. The man was not far from us, having been escorted into a small study that was adjacent to the parlour. When we entered, he was sitting with his hands clenched on his knees, his face pale but composed, though his eyes flickered nervously between us. Holmes took his time, examining every aspect of the room. The furniture was neat but sparse. A few bookshelves, a writing desk, and a solitary chair near the window. There were no personal touches, no photographs or letters to reveal anything about Willoughby's inner life. It felt like a room prepared for interrogation, not the dwelling of a man who had once worked in a place of privilege and comfort. "Mr. Willoughby," Holmes said, his voice calm but edged with purpose, "I need you to explain something to me." Willoughby stiffened but didn't speak. His lips trembled slightly. Holmes took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Why were you in the study this afternoon, Mr. Willoughby?" Willoughby swallowed hard, his voice breaking slightly. I didn't go into the study, Mr. Holmes. I was in the office, working on some correspondence. I told the police everything." Holmes shook his head. "You see, there is a problem with your statement, Mr. Willoughby. Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper, saw the study door ajar and assumed you had been inside. The question is, why would she think that?" Willoughby looked away, his face tightening. "I don't know. I wasn't in the study, I swear it." Holmes leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. "But she was right, wasn't she? You were in the study, Mr. Willoughby. You must have been. And you knew that Mr. Holworth was in the process of reading his letter, didn't you?" Willoughby's eyes flickered toward the door, but he didn't answer immediately. Holmes pressed on. "You feared for your life. Your employer had just discovered something dangerous, something that might have led to your downfall. It was your life or his. And when you heard that Holworth had received a letter, you made your move. Poison on the doorknob. It was the perfect crime." Willoughby's hands trembled, and for the first time his composure cracked. He glanced down at the table, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. I never meant to kill him," he whispered hoarsely. "I never wanted that to happen. I wanted him to stop threatening everything I had worked for." Holmes' voice softened, but only slightly. "You were complicit in something much darker than you realized, weren't you? You were too afraid of losing your position, your power. And so you did what you thought was necessary." Willoughby's breath quickened, and his voice grew desperate. "I didn't want to hurt him. I never thought it would go so far. But when I heard about the letter he received, when I saw how paranoid he was becoming..." Holmes' gaze pierced him. "Tell me, Mr. Willoughby, what exactly was in that letter?" Willoughby's face paled. It was nothing. A warning. Just a warning. Holmes' eyes sharpened. A warning from who? Willoughby looked away. I was the one who wrote it." The confession hung in the air like a heavy fog. Holmes nodded, as if he had already suspected as much. "The letter that Holworth received was meant for you, wasn't it? A warning to let you know that someone had discovered your secret." Willoughby's face twisted in pain. "Yes, but I didn't write it to hurt him. I didn't know what else to do. It was supposed to be a subtle reminder that I wasn't the one you needed to fear. It was supposed to get him to back off." Holmes leaned back, considering the man before him. "And how did you plan to make him back off, Mr. Willoughby?" Willoughby's eyes were glassy with fear. I didn't plan it this way. I just wanted him to stop, to leave me in peace." His voice faltered. "I never meant for him to die." Holmes turned to Lestrade. "It's clear that Mr. Willoughby had no intention of murdering Holworth. However, his actions were reckless, and the consequences have been devastating." Lestrade scowled. "So you're telling me this was all an accident?" Holmes gave a curt nod. "The poison was never meant for Holworth. Willoughby planted it on the doorknob, but he didn't account for the way the poison would be absorbed through Holworth's skin. It was a fatal miscalculation." Willoughby's voice broke. I didn't know it would kill him. I never meant for him to die." Holmes' gaze softened, just for a moment. No one can predict the outcome of their actions in such circumstances. "But the fact remains, Mr. Willoughby, that your interference led to Mr. Holworth's untimely death." Willoughby collapsed into the chair, his face buried in his hands. His shoulders shook with sobs, the weight of guilt pressing down on him like a physical force. Holmes stood in silence for a long moment, his mind clearly racing. Then he turned toward the door. "Lestrade, I believe our investigation is nearing its conclusion. However, there is one more piece of this puzzle we need to address. Lestrade frowned. What do you mean? Holmes' eyes flickered toward Willoughby, who was still trembling with grief. There is one person who has yet to speak the truth. One person who may know more about this situation than they have revealed. Lestrade raised an eyebrow. Who's that? Holmes' lips curled into a faint smile. Mrs. Louisa Holworth. Lestrade looked stunned. You suspect her? Holmes nodded. I suspect she has been hiding something. Something that connects her to this whole affair. He turned toward Willoughby. We must ask her one final question, and I believe it is time she answers. Willoughby looked up, his eyes wide. But she's innocent, Holmes. She had no part in this. It was just a misunderstanding. We only wanted to stop him from ruining us. Holmes' eyes darkened. A misunderstanding that cost a man his life. The truth, Mr. Willoughby, is often far darker than we wish to admit. As we left Willoughby's room, the weight of his words lingered in the air. There was more to this story than met the eye, and Holmes was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. We headed toward Mrs. Holworth's chambers. The truth was about to unfold in a way none of us could have predicted. Chapter 5. The final revelation. The dim glow of the gas lamps flickered along the hallway as Holmes, Lestrade, and I approached Mrs. Louisa Holworth's chambers. The weight of the case hung in the air, each step taking us closer to the truth we had long pursued. Willoughby's confession had answered many questions, yet something remained unresolved. Holmes, as always, sensed the missing piece before any of us did. Lestrade knocked firmly on the door. A soft rustling was heard before Mrs. Holworth's voice, calm yet weary, responded. Come in. Holmes stepped forward first, his sharp eyes scanning the room as we entered. Mrs. Holworth was seated in a high-backed chair near the window, gazing out into the night. A faint reflection of her pale face was visible against the darkened glass. Mr. Holmes, she said softly, turning toward us, I assume you have discovered everything by now. Holmes studied her for a moment before speaking. That depends, Mrs. Holworth. You seem rather unsurprised by our visit. She sighed, her delicate fingers pressing against her temples. I knew you would come eventually. Lestrade, standing beside Holmes, cleared his throat. We have reason to believe you may have had knowledge of Mr. Willoughby's actions before they took place. She let out a bitter laugh. So James has confessed, has he? Holmes took a step closer. Yes, but his confession only confirms what I had already suspected. Mrs. Holworth looked away, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I loved my husband once, Mr. Holmes. A long time ago, when he was a different man. Holmes' voice remained steady. And when did he change? She exhaled, her shoulders trembling slightly. When his business grew, so did his cruelty. He was not the man society knew him to be. Behind closed doors, he was... She paused, her voice catching. He was unbearable. Holmes nodded. And you feared him? A moment of silence passed before she spoke again. Yes, she whispered. I feared him more than anything. Lestrade frowned. Then why protect Willoughby? Why shield him from us? Mrs. Holworth turned to us, her eyes burning with emotion. Because James Willoughby was not just my husband's secretary. He was my only friend, the only person who knew what I suffered. He tried to protect me, and in the end, he made a terrible mistake. Holmes folded his hands behind his back. You knew Willoughby was the one who sent the letter? She nodded. Yes, Holmes continued. And yet you said nothing. I wanted my husband to be afraid, she admitted. I wanted him to feel what I had felt for years. But I never thought it would lead to his death. Lestrade shook his head. You could have come forward. You could have told us the truth. Mrs. Holworth's lips pressed into a thin line. And if I had, would it have changed anything? My husband had power, influence. Do you think anyone would have believed me over him? Holmes studied her, his expression unreadable. And yet, you did not stop Willoughby when you realized what he intended to do. She lowered her head. I didn't know how far he would go. He was desperate, afraid. He acted without thinking. When I saw the horror in his eyes after my husband collapsed, I knew it had gone too far. Lestrade turned to Holmes. "What do you make of it, then? Is she an accomplice?" Holmes was silent for a long moment before shaking his head. "No, she is a victim." Lestrade exhaled sharply. "And Willoughby?" Holmes' expression hardened. He must answer for his crime. His guilt is undeniable, even if his intentions were not born of malice. Mrs. Holworth clasped her hands together, her voice trembling. "Please, show him mercy." Holmes' eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. "The law will decide his fate, Mrs. Holworth." "Not I." She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her face. "Then I suppose there is nothing left to say." Holmes turned to Lestrade. "You have your culprit, Inspector." Lestrade nodded. "That I do." He motioned to one of his officers. "Take Mr. Willoughby into custody." As the officer left to carry out the order, I glanced at Holmes. He seemed distant, lost in thought. As we stepped outside into the cool night air, I finally spoke. "You knew the truth long before Willoughby confessed, didn't you?" Holmes nodded. "Yes. But sometimes, Watson, the truth is not the hardest thing to find. It is the hardest thing to accept." And with that, we left the house behind, the echoes of its tragic past lingering in the silence.